So check this out, right? Obviously, I'm going through and I'm looking at the news and the different articles and things like this, and I ran across this article. This is one that I've actually found myself, so I do my own work. It's not all just y'all sending me articles, but a guy that was exonerated and apparently had spent time on death row. Well, let's just read through the article really quickly, right? So it say a Philadelphia man exonerated after decades in prison, over 30 years apparently, gunned down at a funeral. Christopher Williams, 62, had been fatally shot. Philadelphia police released a statement confirming that a wrongfully convicted man who spent almost 30 years in prison before being released last year was killed at a funeral. The statement explained that Christopher Williams, 62, suffered gunshot wounds to the head. Now, before I deep dive into the article, because I only seen the headline and I like to react to things authentically, before I react to this article, right, only one of two possibilities could have happened. A, either somebody didn't believe that he was wrongfully convicted, and they truly believed that he was guilty of whatever it is, and they didn't want to see him out on the streets, or the streets is just more or worse than what it is that you experience in prison. Now, I can't say either or because I've never been to prison, thankfully, God bless, and then B, apparently they didn't find a killer yet. So let's continue. It says that he'd been wrongfully convicted, spent almost 30 years in prison before being released last year, was killed in a funeral, was taken to Temple University Hospital, pronounced dead shortly after the shooting. In 1989, Williams was convicted in two different cases, consisting of a triple murder and a murder of Michael Haynesworth. Williams, as well as co-defendant Troy Colston, were convicted of Haynesworth's killing in 1992, so that was 3 years later. A year later, Williams and co-defendant Theophilus Wilson were convicted of the triple murder. Philadelphia prosecutors pushed to dismiss the murder convictions against Williams in both cases after discovering compromised testimony. They also found exculpatory evidence that law enforcement knew about but never told defense lawyers. Williams was released only 22 months ago and was working as a carpenter. He planned on eventually starting his own business that would have hired freed convicts. Williams' attorney, Stuart Lebb, discussed the sadness around his death Wednesday. They say it's incredibly tragic. This guy went through decades in prison, 25 years on death row. 25 years on death row. Now, the question that you then have to ask yourself, because nobody will ever really know, especially considering that whatever the crime was, it was done in 1989. The question that you have to ask yourself was he really wrongfully convicted? Now, it's the difference between being wrongfully convicted and actually being a person that perpetuated the crime. Often at times we see, especially in black culture, there's a lot of people that say free such and such, or you know what, I got off on a technicality, or they didn't read me my Miranda rights, or whatever, so on and so forth. But very few times do we ever discuss if somebody is actually guilty of said crime. They get off on a technicality, that's a completely different conversation, versus inconsistent testimony that could or would or would not have sent them to prison and sent them on death row. The sentencing guidelines is based off of what you're convicted of, not whether or not you actually perpetuated the crime and was proven otherwise. So that's the thing that I'm curious about, but I guess we'll never know because either street justice got him, if he did commit the crime, or the streets is just worse than what it is that's happening in prison. They said it's incredibly tragic. Guy went to 25 years on death row for crimes he didn't commit because the system failed. He kept fighting. He wouldn't give up. He just kept insisting that he keep trying different ways of fighting, whether that was to keep his hopes up or was just his own determination and perseverance. That's what he did. He worked very hard with his lawyers to make sure his lawyers kept doing that too. No arrest has been made. Additionally, the weapon has not yet been recovered. And that's pretty much the end of that conversation. So it looks like street justice, because if the dude was working as a carpenter and he wasn't actually involved in anything beyond whatever it is that they identified as far as a part of this murder, it looks like somebody came through and did what they thought he should have been executed for in the first place. And that's scary. It's absolutely scary because he said that he didn't commit the crime, and the streets don't care. And I think both is true at the same time in this particular instance. The street often at times is worse than, let me pull this guy, what do he look like? The street often at times is worse than what it is that you see happening or hear about in prison. And I've even talked to guys, because, I'm actually doing volunteer work today. And I'm at the office right now because I stopped over here to pick up a couple of things and drop off a couple of things. I've talked to some guys that have gotten out of prison, and they say that it was a wild, weird new world. Um, it's a weird new world stepping out of here versus what it was that they had adapted to and was used to in the prison system. And so I'm curious as to what everybody else's thoughts are. I don't even read the comments on these articles. I'm curious as to what everybody's thoughts were, because it's not beyond the realm of possibility that he, you know, was in the streets now that he had been back out of prison. No possibility is off the table. And so I'm not advocating or saying that he is or he isn't. But if he was in Philadelphia, because I know that he was on death row in Philadelphia, if he was in Philadelphia, based off of what I've been hearing and seeing in Philadelphia, anything is a possibility. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. Do you think that the streets is beyond recognition and that it's so bad out here that, you know, even if you were to get out of jail, surviving in the streets, you're less likely, depending on the neighborhood and the environment that you in, versus something that he had adapted to and he became used to, and now, again, it's a completely different conversation when you're talking about a dude that's on death row. But they saying that he was a part of this homicide back in 1989, convicted in 1992, and then he fought for the idea that he wasn't the person that perpetuated or committed the crime. Technology and everything is so much different today than it was in yesteryear, and so it's pretty interesting because in 1989 I was 7. Yeah, I was 7 years old. And so in 1989, it's a lot of people that did get convicted for things that they actually didn't commit. And then the other side of it is that, and this is the part that I'm really curious about your perspective is how do you feel about forgiveness? How do you feel about the idea that regardless of what the crime was that was committed, that you're able to forgive? And a lot of people are going to say, well, it's easy, to say it on the outside looking in, but when you're in a situation in which, a person, a loved one is gone, I don't care how long it's been, I don't care if it's 30 years, I don't care if it's 25 years, I don't care if it's 50 years, people want to see blood. And so it's kind of like street justice, mob rules. I don't think that most people believe in forgiveness. I don't think that most people even care about forgiveness. I think that, people feel what they feel, and there ain't no water under the bridge. It's a forever thing. And so if he was to come back and he was out on the streets and he was wrongly convicted, I think the possibility of him surviving on the same streets that he was convicted from in an area where, allegedly he was convicted at, and his alleged victims were killed, the possibility of him surviving in that environment is slim to none. But let me know what your thoughts are about this particular article about a man that was exonerated is gunned down at a funeral. Get up out them streets, man. Stay away from people that don't add value into your life. Move, leave. If you are not in an environment that's conducive for what it is that you got going on, get out of here. I love you. I appreciate you. I'm going to holler at you later. Peace.